God, help us to accept each other and to accept these good, hard words that Jesus and the Apostle Paul give to us this day. We may have heard them many times, but hearing isn't always listening. Open our ears and hearts once more, O God. Send your Spirit to mold and make us into the people and the community that you would have us be. And I pray, O God, that my words would be faithful. It is in your name we pray. Amen. So, like many of you, I've been traveling a bit this summer and taking quite a few airplanes. And what I've noticed is that while there are lots and lots of rules about air travel, there are also some unspoken customs that, when followed, can make flying a much more enjoyable experience for everyone. Such as, if you are a passenger in the window or the aisle seat, then you should let the person in the middle have both armrests. When you finish in the lavatory, you should wipe down the sink for the next person who will come behind you. If you have 2 carry-on bags, just put one in the overhead bin, please. That will leave more room for others. And when you're deplaning, let the people in the row in front of you get off first. Unless there's someone in the very back of the plane with a tight connection, then maybe they should get off the plane before you. Now, sometimes airline employees will make suggestions about ways that passengers can be more thoughtful or courteous to one another, but it's up to us, the travelers, to choose whether or not we are going to engage in these small acts of kindness toward each other. And because these days air travel is even more expensive and inconvenient and unpleasant and stressful than it used to be, it doesn't always bring out the best in us, does it? This is why these little reminders of what we owe to each other can really make a huge difference. Now, this is a simple example of what the contemporary ethicist T.M. Scanlon calls contractualism. The reasonable rules that we can all choose to live by in order to create a more civil and peaceful society. In particular, contractualism is useful in situations where there's disagreement or conflict, where we are not our best as human beings. Scanlon's seminal book, What We Owe to Each Other, was deeply influential to the creator of the TV show The Good Place, Michael Schur. The idea that people who live together in a society are connected in a way that makes us both responsible to and for each other is a central concept in this comedy about the afterlife, in which characters have to decide how they are going to live together for all eternity. In one episode, Eleanor Shellstrop, who has ended up in the good place by mistake, is trying to learn to become a better person in the afterlife than she was on Earth. And she has promised Michael, the architect of the good place, that she will help him figure out why things keep going wrong in their neighborhood, even though she's pretty sure that her presence there is part of the reason why. Her assigned eternal soulmate, Chidi Anagonye, a deceased philosophy professor, tries to use contractualism to explain to Eleanor why she should keep her promise to Michael to help. In fact, he picks up T.M. Scanlon's book, which just happens to be there with him in heaven. He says, imagine a group of people are trying to come up with rules for a new society. Like if your Uber driver talks to you, then the ride should be free, Eleanor suggests. Sure. But anyone can veto any rule that they think is unfair. So if you said that you thought we should be able to break our promises without any repercussions, someone would veto that rule. Well, my first rule would be that no one could veto my rule, Eleanor responded. Well, that's called tyranny, and it's generally frowned upon. But if you do make a promise to someone, you should keep it, Chidi says. The fundamental idea of contractualism is that if I am willing to constrain or modify the pursuit of my own interests to the same degree that you are willing to constrain or modify yours, then we can design a society where everyone's needs can be met equally. Even if we don't see eye to eye on everything, finding a way to coexist peacefully is our top priority. And in the end, we can have a social contract that we can all agree to because everyone's interests are not more or less important than the others, but equally important. This week, a colleague of mine shared a meme on social media. It said, "Tip your server, return your shopping cart, pick up a piece of trash, hold the door for the person behind you, let someone into your lane. Small acts of kindness have a ripple effect. That's how we change the world." You see, we don't have to imagine that we're living in a new society or in the afterlife to engage in exercises of contractualism. The fact is, we make these kinds of choices every day, probably dozens of times a day. When we let a car merge into traffic in front of us, when we return our shopping cart to the rack. Michael Schur writes that when we apply Scanlon's theory to the world we live in, the world comprising thousands of small moments and decisions and interactions, contractualism makes a pretty good divining rod for bad or unjust behavior. Contractualism, it's the minimum basis for a livable society. But it might not be the only tool we want to use when making ethical decisions. Because you see, it's kind of easy to be kind to one another when the stakes are low, when it really doesn't cost us anything or inconvenience us too much to think about other people's needs vis-a-vis our own. When other people are being basically kind and reasonable, we can do the same in return. But what about when people are being jerks? You know, the world is full of people not living by these unwritten rules of social engagement. There are tons of people cutting into traffic, taking their shoes off on the airplane. And when they're not holding up their end of the social bargain, are we supposed to just let them walk all over us? Well, this is where Jesus comes in. With his Sermon on the Mount or the Plain. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those that curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other also. If anyone takes your shirt or your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, this idea of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you is another form of contractualism, but it is one that goes well beyond the minimum. We like to call it the golden rule. But in Jesus' time, in various cultural and religious interpretations, it was more of a silver rule, commonly phrased in negative rather than positive terms. If you don't want something done to you, then don't do it to someone else. Seneca, a Roman philosopher during Jesus' lifetime, wrote, "Expect from another what you have done to another." But you see, Jesus was trying to change the social norms of reaction and retribution. This transactional way that people treated one another, and calling his followers to something deeper. To not allow another person's actions to determine your own. The norm for our behavior, if we are seeking to follow the way of Jesus, is to seek to embody the very nature of God. The Franciscan priest and founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, Richard Rohr, writes that in our current society, we have three cultures at work, each with its own bottom line. A political culture based on the manipulation of power, an economic culture based on the manipulation of money, and a religious culture based on the manipulation of some theory about God. These are the directions that human culture takes whenever it is left to its own devices, Richard Rohr writes. But Jesus announced, lived, and inaugurated a new social order that is an alternative to each of the above. It is called the reign of God. Because to Rohr, you see, God is not a philosophical system. God is a person, an entity to be imitated, to be enjoyed and loved. And it is from our relationship with God that we come to understand how we are supposed to relate to one another. Jesus teaches us that right relationship with God and our neighbor is the ultimate and daily criterion of how we are supposed to live. So if a social order allows and encourages, even mandates, good connectedness between people and creation, people and events, people and people, people and God, then you have a truly sacred culture. You have the reign of God. He writes, it would not be a world without pain or mystery, but simply a world where we would be in good contact with all things, where we would be connected and in communion. Last week, I was in El Salvador with some of our youth and some youth and adults from Christ Crossman UMC. And the trip that we participated in, we called it an immersion trip. And the idea was for us to go and listen and learn, to experience being in relationship with people. And when I came back, people kept asking me, how was your trip? What did you do? Did you build something? Did you paint a house or teach in a school? And you see, I've been on lots of mission trips where this was the focus, service to others. But this trip was different. In this trip, our ministry was simply to be present, to hear people's stories, to honor their lives by showing up and listening to them. And over again, people told us how much this mattered. They were so appreciative that we had come all this way and that we had brought all these young people to learn about Oscar Romero, Rutilio Grande, and the Maryknoll sisters who were martyred, but also to listen to women who had struggled for decades just to have access to water in their community, to youth who were trying to teach their peers about sexual education and gender equity, to people who every day are working towards reconciliation, forgiveness, and peace in their communities. One day we met with a woman named Candelaria. She had been a disciple of one of the martyred nuns, Dorothy Cazell, and she continues in Sister Dorothy's ministry to this day. But Candelaria told us that for a long time she hated America because of what our government had done to El Salvador during the war. And then a few years ago, she was invited to speak at the School of the Americas protest in Georgia. And she said as she was standing before the crowd and leading the litany of the martyrs, she looked out and she saw all these faces, Americans, who were standing in solidarity with the people of El Salvador and Central America and protesting the actions of their government. And it changed her heart. She now knew that there were people in America who cared about her, about her people, and who were in solidarity with her. This is what I believe we owe to each other. To work to understand our connectedness as human beings. To live into the truth that our lives are bound up with each other. To act out of the understanding that our well-being, our safety, our security is connected with that of our neighbors, both those who live down the street and on the street and around the world. We owe each other those small acts of kindness, as well as generous acts of solidarity and compassion and forgiveness and justice. We owe this to those who are kind and reasonable, and to those who are not. To each person, to ourselves, we owe more than just the bare minimum. We owe each other as much of the peace and presence of Christ that we have received and that we seek to embody each day. And that, my friends,